Disclaimer: this is audio horror fiction. If darkness or the creatures it holds scares you, leave now. Still listening? Good. Then let's begin. The first time I saw him was a Tuesday night right before my 7th birthday. It was around 11 p.m., and I was too excited to fall asleep. I was thinking about presents and cake and friends. I remember I was drifting between asleep and awake when I felt my mattress creak and depressed by my legs as if someone had sat on it. I opened my eyes and found that someone had. He was tall, even as he sat a little hunched. His hands were covered in blood, and he was staring at them with eyes buried in dark circles, and he was crying. Silently, but still violently. I sat up in my bed, and he didn't seem to notice. I stared at him crying for a long time. I don't know why I didn't scream or yell for my parents. There was a stranger in my room, on my bed after all, but I was a stupidly brave and curious child, and watching him I felt no fear. Eventually, I got tired of his tears. I reached forward and tugged on his sleeve. "Are you okay, mister?" He looked at me then, and I saw his eyes were brownish, graying, and tired. He didn't say anything. "Don't cry. I'm sorry you feel bad. Do you want a hug?" I asked, because that was what my mom always asked me after I had been sobbing. He kept looking at me without a word, and I took that as a yes. I wrapped my small arms as far as they would go around his arm and chest and rested my head against his upper arm. He smelled vaguely of laundry detergent and cold nights. I held him for as long as I could before my arms got tired, humming a lullaby like my mom would do for me. He was crying again, and I felt a tear fall onto my arm. It was warm and wet and trickled down off my arm, falling onto his shirt. Sleep came for me soon enough. As it took me into its blissful embrace, I vaguely felt my arms slip away from the weeping man that they had been latched onto. It felt like a dream when I felt the arm I had been using as a pillow shift, and hands grabbed me under the arms, lifting me gently back to my actual pillow. I woke up, having forgotten the strange man. It was only when I sat at the breakfast table that my mother exclaimed at the bloodstains on the underside of my short sleeves that I remembered. I saw her worried face and babbled about the sad man with bloody hands from the previous night. Her worry turned to slight annoyance as my father laughed indulgently, asking me questions about my late-night visitor. I had a history of interesting imaginary friends, and my mother had hoped I'd outgrown them. But she was puzzled about the bloodstains while my father dismissed it as markers or paint. She and I both quickly forgot, though, as the time for my birthday party rolled around. That birthday went by, and soon I was waiting for the next one. The crying man came and sat on my bed every Tuesday night, and eventually I stopped telling my parents about him. They were getting very irritated and kind of concerned, but they didn't need to be. I knew the crying man meant no harm to me, and as the months passed, I struck up a sort of comfortable companionship with him. I would talk to him about my week. I would tell him about my friends, but I never told my friends about him. They had called me crazy. I'd tell him about my new games and what I'd seen riding my bike around town. Occasionally, I'd tell him something cool I learned at school. He usually listened with interest, looking at me with exhausted eyes the color of firewood. He nodded sometimes, but he'd never say a word. And sometimes he'd ruffle my hair or pat my back, and the blood on his hand would come onto me, which I was sure to remove before my mother found out. I grew used to him being there, sitting at the end of my bed into the early hours of Wednesday, and he would always be sad. I mean, sure, every now and then tears would stop, but his eyes would be tortured and wet, and his breathing would be kinda hitched and weird. And then his eyes would overflow again, and we'd be back where we started. A crying man and a child trying to console him in whatever way. I tried telling him jokes and funny stories. I leaned against him or patted his arm. I hugged him as much as a pair of small arms could and told him it would be all right. I always got the feeling he never believed me. And then one day he smiled at me. A weak, trembling smile, but a smile. I had been telling him about my baby sister who had dumped a bowl of cereal on her head that morning and was seemingly unbothered by it as my parents groaned and laughed. I remember I was laughing as I told him, because to my child's brain that was the funniest thing ever. I could barely get the words out, I was laughing so hard, but eventually I did and he smiled at me. The slight upturn of his lips shocked me so bad I stopped laughing. He didn't notice because he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking somewhere over my head, and I sat looking up at him entranced. And then he chuckled to himself, a small light sound. It made me smile. He looked like he was remembering something, and I was quiet, not wanting to pull him from his reverie. I watched as he closed his eyes and chuckled again softly, tears pushing their way out from beneath his shut eyelids. He was sad again, even though he was smiling, and I reached out and took his hand in both of mine. He opened his eyes, startled, and as they came to rest on me, I felt something in them that I had not felt before. They were still the broken eyes of a broken man, but between the cracks there was now a fierce warmth. It made me feel safe somehow, untouchable. It was right around my 12th birthday when he began to change. He didn't cry as hard anymore, or stare at the red on his hands, usually wide open in his lap. Sure, tears still fell down his cheeks, but his eyes were hard, staring at my window, and he would clench and unclench his bloody fist, biting on his lower lip. I dismissed it, although I did find it to be strange. A strange man was bound to do strange things. I still talked to him about all the normal things, but he didn't really seem to pay that much attention. He would just nod absent-mindedly when I tapped his shoulder. I didn't really mind. I was fine with him just being there. He was the only one who had never judged me. I could tell him anything. Then came the night that I lost him, my secret friend. That night I realized he was more than that. My guardian, my defender. The night he spoke to me for the first and last time. I had been unusually quiet that night, feeling weird about this crush at school. I didn't really want to talk about it, and it must have seemed very unlike me because for the first time in weeks, my friend looked away from the window and turned to me. I saw the stone in his gaze melt away until there was only his old, soft sadness. It was this gentle look of his that prompted me to ask him what I'd been wondering for years. "Why is there blood on your hands?" I whispered. He was silent, and his eyes were getting very watery. I tried again. "Why don't you ever wash it off?" He shook his head at me, and his gaze once again became stone as he turned back to the window. I sighed, pulling my covers closer and turning to face the wall. As I settled into sleep, I heard his voice. It was quiet and deep and sounded kind of achy, like when your throat hurts from yelling a lot. All it said was, "I don't want to forget." I looked at him over my shoulder. He was still and stoic, a statue staring at the window, glistening red fingers curling and uncurling. The tears made tracks down his cheeks, and I found myself falling asleep to his breathing, which was steady now. The shatter of glass woke me. There was a black masked man kneeling in the shards. He had a glinting knife in his hand. I scrambled back against the wall. He headed towards me and stopped to listen to my parents' footsteps running up the stairs. He was quicker than them, though, than anyone I'd ever seen, and stronger, too. He had my heavy dresser against the door before they could even reach it. I was terrified as he looked to me then, while my parents banged at the door trying to get it open. As he approached me, I realized it wasn't a mask. His face was just a dark void, with two burning silver pinpoints of light where his eyes should have been. My fear had left me mute and paralyzed, and was now successfully suffocating me. Then another figure stepped out of the shadows. As my eyes darted to the movement, the intruder's gaze followed. He didn't even have time to react before my crying friend stabbed him in the stomach with some sort of dagger. The faceless guy tried to fight, but really, he never stood a chance. My friend had been waiting a long time to do this, and that night his sadness had changed to anger that could not be contained. I watched as he stabbed once, twice, as many times as the number of tears he had cried. I didn't even know I was crying until I tasted the saltiness from the tears that had found their way between my lips. I could vaguely hear my mother screaming outside my bedroom door, and my father talking frantically on his phone while ramming his shoulder against the wood. My dresser was starting to shake with every push of his, and it soon would fall over. The crying man was done. He stood over the mutilated body, which was now emitting black smoke. He was breathing harshly, and for the first time ever, I was afraid of him. I began to sniffle, and he looked at me. He stared at me in surprise as I began to cry harder. He approached the bed slowly, and I was sobbing uncontrollably by the time he took me in his arms. My fear of him vanished then as I buried my head in his shoulder, the familiar smell of cold nights and flowery detergent comforting me. I knew him. He was my strange friend, my weekly visitor, my broken protector. I clutched at him with my fingers, grabbing him tight, and he held me as the dresser fell with a deafening crash and my father tried to force the door open unsuccessfully. As my mother screamed my name from outside my shattered window, begging for me to be all right, as my neighbors roused, as the sirens drew closer and closer. He held me, sheltered me, soothed me against the panic happening everywhere outside of my room, and I closed my eyes and fell asleep to his blood-stained hands rubbing my back and his usual tears in my hair. The rest was a blur to me, and I only remember bits. I found out the body that my sad man had stabbed wasn't there when the cops got into my room, and neither was the sad man. There was just me, curled up in a little ball on top of my blankets, sound asleep. My shirt was blood-stained and my hair was wet. There was glass on the floor and the jar of seashells I kept in my dresser had cracked. My parents were crying as they hugged me, but it wasn't the same. We went to a lot of places with buzzing fluorescent lights and people with uniforms who asked questions I didn't want to answer. But I answered them as best as I could, leaving out my sad man, saying that I just blacked out before the dark man got to my bed and remembered nothing until they had gotten to me. I didn't care about it, any of it. My mind was on Tuesday, wanting to see him, but Tuesday came and went without him, and so did every other Tuesday since then. It's been years since he saved my life, and possibly my soul. It's been years since I last saw him, and God, if I could just see him one more time. But I know I won't. He did his duty to me, and perhaps to countless children before me. He saved us, and redeemed himself in everything but his own eyes. His own tired eyes. I'll never know why, nor will I ever find out the reason for his eternal sadness, for the blood on his hands, for the Tuesday nights specifically, though I have my guesses. Oh, my gentle guardian, my weeping watchman, my old friend. Thank you. I won't ever forget. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and share to help feed the dark machine.